Rabbi Elliot Baskin is a spiritual leader and Jewish globetrotter. Fortunately for us, he is right here in Denver, Colorado. And he hopes who helps build meaning through learning, counseling, and ritual, both in the land of elk and honey, and volunteering for the holidays internationally in such places as Taiwan, Guatemala, Myanmar, Bali, and most recently, Suriname. So please welcome Rabbi Baskin for Jews of the Jungle.
Shalom, everybody, and thanks so much for coming on this frosty day to warm your hearts by being transported to the tropical, undiscovered paradise of Suriname. Now, by a show of hands, raise your hands if you've ever been to Suriname. I don't think we got too many. In fact, when I told my friends that we were going to be going, my wife and I, my wife is Hillary, a wonderful orthodontist, and together we do brachas and braces, or shul and drool, or Torah and teeth, that we were going to be going to Suriname for the holidays. People said, oh, I've never been to that part of Africa. Where is it? So today I want to share with you the most undiscovered, unique place in maybe even in the world, but definitely in the Jewish world. And it's my pleasure to be coming to you virtually in your living room or wherever you may be via Zoom, because 2 years ago, I was watching a webinar done by Kulanu, which is an outreach organization to emerging Jews worldwide, and learned about the community of Suriname. And I was so fascinated by what I learned that I wanted to volunteer. So this past high holidays, we went from Rosh HaShana to Simchat Torah. And I want to talk to you about this really incredible place. Now, if we were here in person, we would be passing out chocolate. And Rebecca, being a good sport, has dark chocolate kisses, which means at the next event, go up to her and get one in person. And we will be able to, I would want you to sample delicious Surinamese coffee and the chocolate and the sugar, but we'll have to do it virtually. So we're going to be transported on a journey, but first, a costume change. But here's my costume. And where are we going? We're going to Paramaribo. And this is such an unusual place, which is the capital of Suriname, that on the corner, it has the latitude and the longitude, because no one knows where it is. So to see it, I will be showing you some slides. If you do have a question, again, put it in the chat or raise your hand, and Rebecca, our awesome facilitator, and her wonderful staff at Kavod on the Road will bring it to my attention. So we'll be going through an Odyssey journey and then opening it up for questions. But if you have something urgent, don't hesitate to raise your hand. So let me begin with, let's see here, and from the beginning. No. Sorry. Let me stop the share. Wait a minute. And you'd think we'd all be experts in Zoom now, but it's still not. Wait a minute. Let me end the show. Great. Okay, let me go to the beginning. From the beginning. Okay. Can everyone see the title screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Oh, okay. Let me. Okay. And can you see it now?
There, yes, now we're good.
Now we're good. Great. Okay. So our presentation is entitled Holy Sugar and a Rusty Nail, Jews of the Jungle, 4 centuries of Suriname Jewry for Kavod on the road. And this is the last line, Mit Rabbi Elliot J. Baskin. Okay, trivia question now. Can anyone identify the language of my name at the end of our title slide? If you can, put it in the chat. What language do you think it is? Mit Rabbein Elliot.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, can anyone? Oh, let's see. We have in the chat. Someone says, Cherie, of course, you're wonderful. And it is indeed in Dutch. Suriname is one of 3 countries in Latin America which does not speak a Latin language of either Spanish or Portuguese. The 3 countries are the Guianas, one of which they used to be known by their old names of British, Dutch, and French Guiana, speaking those languages. So first, let's see where we are. And you'll see we're at the top part of South America. It is the smallest country in South America. And yet it's still pretty big for a small country. It has around the size of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom in terms of size. So you'll see it's tucked up there in the northeast corner. To the right of it, or to the east, is French Guiana. To the west is Guyana or British Guiana. And to the south is Brazil. And all of that is known as the Guyana or the river basin. And it's a place which is sort of difficult to get to. And that's why many people may not have heard of it. You may have heard of French Guiana. How many people, or raise show of hands, saw the movie Papillon? That was in the 60s. Or heard about the Alfred Dreyfus affair. And in the Alfred Dreyfus affair, he was sent as punishment to Devil's Island, which was the most isolated part of the French Empire for punishment. So that's why we've heard of French Guiana. You may have heard a little bit about Guyana because it's now an oil exporting country. And there are many people from Guyana in the diaspora. We were talking about with Jay earlier and said that there was a lot of Guyanese people who were in Brooklyn and everywhere. But in Suriname, unless you are from the Netherlands, you probably never heard of it. It's an interesting place that it has really, it's a small population. It's a little bit like the population of the less than the city of Denver, of about 600,000 people. The capital, as I mentioned before, is Paramaribo, and it's one of the most ethnically diverse countries in South America. The largest makeup of the people is Hindustani or South Asian from India. Then there are the Maroons, and we'll talk about them as descendants of Jewish plantation owners who are African American. There are Creoles, mixed race people. There are the Javanese or the Indonesians. A lot more of people who are sort of all of the above. There are Chinese people, there are Amerindian people who are the indigenous, and 1% of the population are white. In terms of religions, the majority are the Protestant, but then there's a large number of Hindus, Catholics, Muslims, and other. Jews make up about 1% of the population, actually less than 1%. Although at one time, the largest number of Jews in the Western Hemisphere was in Suriname in the 17th century. But now it's just a tiny percentage, but has an incredible legacy. The official language is Dutch, and people speak a local Creole called Sranan Togo, which means literally the Suriname tongue. And it's an interesting place because if you ever want to go on vacation, you get a guidebook. Well, the guidebook we just had going to Maui, where we got back from on Monday, and we also had other people who got back from there, it was the 20th edition. Here, it's the 2nd edition, because while there are many tour books in Dutch, in English, this is just about it, because it's truly undiscovered. In terms of politically, it's a democracy, and the president, who you see just behind me with the sash, is actually Hindustani or South Asian, and he's the 9th president of Suriname. Since 1973, there's been 9 presidents, and that was the year that the country became independent from the Netherlands. It is a foodie paradise, from Indonesian food to Chinese food to Dutch food, and my favorite is the Hindustani or the Indian food. And here you can see what we would get, the veggie rollies, which were delicious. And then in the top right-hand corner, can you see it says Aloha, Roti, and then ambulance. They actually have an ambulance, which is a food truck that serves delicious Indian takeaway food. All the food was very spicy. And Suriname is the most forested country in the world. 93% of the country is jungle. And when you think about the Amazon, that's what you think about. Water, mosquitoes, lush vegetation, beautiful plants. The flora is gorgeous, and exotic fauna. So the wildlife is rare and spectacular, from little monkeys to green tree frogs to beautiful parrots to even jaguars. And there's unusual customs with all of this fauna throughout the country. So every Sunday morning at dawn, people will gather for a bird singing competition. Now, this is actually at Independence Square. In the background is the presidential palace. And you'll see all of these guys walking around with a little cage and a parrot. And you'll see one of the cages is hooded, and in there is a female parrot. So when they want to get the male parrots to start singing, they take off the cover and they start chirping. And you'll see the 2 individuals on the left, and what they're doing, they're recording over a 5-minute period how many chirps they hear. And the parrot that chirps the most, there are big cash prizes. So people take care of their parrots very well because it's a very lucrative, engaging pastime. And there's a lot of monkey business. So there we were in the jungle. We traveled 2 hours to get to the port, and then we were in these long canoes. And then as we're enjoying our breakfast, we had this monkey business of people who were coming to join us. And one of the most intriguing parts of the country is not just its culinary diversity or its ethnic diversity or the diversity of the flora and the fauna, but the interfaith diversity. At the top, you'll see a picture from the Dutch Reformed Church. In the middle, you'll see a picture taken of one of the Hindu temples. And the bottom picture, I think, is the most intriguing because that happens to be on the left. You would recognize that as a mosque. On the right is the synagogue where I had the privilege of serving. And it's from that mosque that when you go in and you look out the windows face east, of course, to and Jerusalem. And through one of them, you see the synagogue. And through the other one, you see the Roman Catholic Basilica. And the synagogue and the mosque are side by side. So if you take the Surinamese bus tour, you will see the brochure, which I have here, and they advertise, they say, the stop will be made by a unique site, a synagogue located right next to a mosque, an illustration of how a variety of hospitable ethnic groups live together in harmony. And I think that was one of the most intriguing things, that where else can you go to see the largest mosque in the Caribbean, situated by the oldest continuously practicing synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. And Paramaribo is a gorgeous city. They like to say it's where Amsterdam meets the American West. And it's known as the Wooden City, and it was placed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2002. You see these old 18th century and a few 17th century buildings, all made of wood. And they're absolutely gorgeous. However, because Suriname is a poor country, they're not always well maintained. But you can tell synagogue, and there are actually 2 synagogues, one that's currently in use, one that's leased out, because they are meticulously maintained. This is a picture actually of the largest wooden building in the world. It's the Roman Catholic Basilica, and it was originally adapted from the Jewish theater that was in use in 1826. And a little bit of history. I'm a collector. I love stamps, a philatelist. I love collecting coins. And in fact, my interest in traveling really came from collecting stamps, because whenever I'd get a stamp, I'd say, I've never heard of this country. Where is it from? So you can tell a lot about a country and its priorities by its stamps. So over on the left, you'll see the stamp in 1992, commemorating the expulsion of the Jews from Spain that happened 500 years ago. And that's really where the story of Jewish life began in Suriname. That when the Jews were given 3 choices, and they were told by Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand, that you could either convert to Catholicism, you could leave the country, or you could be executed. Now, we Jews, we don't like to die. So that was pretty much ruled out. Converting was indeed a possibility, and many of the Jews did convert outwardly and then continued to practice Judaism in secret. And we hear about that with the conversos, or the hidden Jews in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, we see a lot of that, and we hear the stories, particularly in southern Colorado and New Mexico, which was all part of the greater Mexico at one time. And in fact, some people even think that perhaps a third of Latin America has Jewish roots, because the third of the choices of either converting or being killed was to leave the country. And they first went to Portugal, which was the closest place. But in 1497, the Jews were expelled from Portugal. So where do you go? Many Jews went to the Netherlands, because that was a very open and tolerant place. And many other Jews went to places around the Mediterranean, like the land of Greece, where I know Cherie's ancestors come from. Many went to Turkey. Many went to North Africa. And many of them went all the way to the New World. And many of them settled in Recife, Brazil, which was a place which was originally Portuguese. And then the Dutch conquered it. And then the Portuguese took it back. And then the Dutch people had to flee. Now, some of them went all the way to that dusty little island in the middle of the Atlantic that no one's probably heard of, called New Amsterdam. But the smart Jews went to this beautiful colony called Dutch Guiana, or what was later to be called Suriname. And the Dutch Jews took the knowledge that they had learned from Portugal of cultivating sugarcane. And sugar was the petroleum of the 17th century, the most valuable substance you could get. And that's why places like Barbados and Suriname were the most valuable real estate in the world, mile by mile. So if you will look to the center, you'll see pictures of the Jewish settlement that was built in Suriname. And it was built by the original capital. The capital was called Torah Rica. And this is the only country in the world whose original capital comes from a Hebrew word. Think of Torah and then Rica. Rica as in Costa Rica, which means the rich coast. Torah Rica means the Torah is rich. The Torah is valuable. And so the Jews founded a settlement there in the 17th century of over 2,000 Jews, which were independent, had their own court system, their own security, their own schools, their own financial system, and their own agriculture. And they were independent, so to speak, and were able to flourish and incredibly prosperous in the middle of the jungle. And there'll be more of that later in the presentation. And on the right, you will see a picture of the beautiful synagogue made out of wood, of which I will have also more to share. Now, it looks like a typical Dutch colonial structure, because when you think about it, what do the synagogues here in the United States look like? Well, they look like churches. And what do the synagogues in Morocco look like? they look like moss. And the synagogues in India, they look like Hindu temples. Yes.
Mess with them a little bit.
Is that a
I wasn't
question?
calling you, buddy.
I'm trying to mute. Please mute yourselves.
But if you want to maybe type the question in, or
Yep, there we go. But Rabbi, we did have a question. Somebody asked, she missed hearing why you were in Suriname leading services in the first place.
great question. Well, I've been here in Denver for 25 years. We moved from Hartford, Connecticut 25 years ago. And I love to tease, we moved from the land of mink and money to the land of elk and honey. And here I served for 20 years as Denver's Jewish community chaplain. I'm now doing part of the rabbinic team at Shalom Park, and did also serve at Kavod on the Road for a spiritual quest group. And because I had some chaplaincy, I was free for the holidays. And for many years, I was the rabbi in Beth Evergreen. And for 10 years, the visiting rabbi in Durango. And now in my semi-retirement, I wanted to be able to give back to small Jewish communities that were isolated in the world and to volunteer there for the holidays in return for food and board and transportation. So for these small communities that can't afford a rabbi, I love to volunteer. So I started out about 7 years ago and led high holiday services in Guatemala. The next year I went to Bali and founded a Reform congregation there. The next year I went to Myanmar and served in a 150-year-old Baghdadi synagogue in Yangon. The next year went back to Guatemala, and before COVID, volunteered in Taipei, Taiwan, and loved the experience. And when I heard about Suriname, I was intrigued because I had heard it was the oldest Jewish community in the Western Hemisphere and was a place where they had a sand synagogue. And let me show you the synagogue, what it looks like. There I am in front of the synagogue on the left. To the right, you'll see the mosque. And to the right of that, you'll see two wooden buildings, one of which is the mikveh, the other which is what they call the moadon, or the community room, where they have their meals and learning and a small school. And if you look below, you'll see this absolutely gorgeous synagogue with an old chandelier, beautiful mahogany wood. And if it looks a little bit familiar, for those of you who have been to Amsterdam, after you've seen the Anne Frank house, you'll go to what they call the Portuguese synagogue. And it was built reminiscent in the style of the Portuguese synagogue there. You'll see on the left the mikveh from the 1820s. To the left of it was the old rabbi's house, now the office building. And then you'll see a Holocaust memorial to the right with the names of all the Jews who perished in the Holocaust. Again, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. We know the story of Anne Frank. And the Jews living in Suriname were all Dutch citizens at the time. You'll see gravestones there, and the gravestones are written in Portuguese, and some of them are written in Hebrew. This is what Neve Shalom, mean literally an oasis for peace, looks like at night. Absolutely gorgeous. And I see, is that a question from Leah or? You can either unmute or we can have, you could write it in the
I
chat.
got it. Sorry. Okay. Would you go back to the last picture and tell me, are those gravestones all lined up next to each other? They look like
They
solar
are
panels?
lined. They are lined up next to each other. Let me just go to.
And where's the bodies? They're under there?
Yes, the body. Okay, so there was they were redoing the a building project for the roads. So they took some of the old stones and they put it in. And I will be showing you the current cemeteries, which are quite unique. So Neve Shalom at night, and look at the inside of the synagogue. My wife and I are from the women's gallery, where people would look down where the women were. Now the synagogue is no longer Orthodox, but it is liberal, which means the men and the women sit together, but they still have the women's balcony. You'll notice the Torahs in the Heichal, which is the Sephardic way of saying the Aron Kodesh or the Ark in the middle. And to the left, you'll see a view of the floor of the synagogue. Now, this is one of 5 sand synagogues in the world. The first was in Amsterdam, the second here in Suriname, and then some of you may have visited in the Caribbean, the 3 other ones. The oldest one on American territory, which is in the American Virgin Islands in St. Thomas, which is actually the oldest synagogue in American territory. In the American mainland, of course, it's the Touro Synagogue. Then we have the oldest synagogue in the Western Hemisphere, also with the Sand Synagogue in Curacao. But the oldest continuously practicing community is indeed in Suriname. And the 5th one was in Kingston, Jamaica. Now, my question for you is a sand synagogue, so how come? And there are many different explanations because everything in Judaism has many different answers. The first answer, God promises Abraham in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, that your children will be as numerous as the stars of the heavens and the sand of the sea. Hence, the sand on the synagogue floor. Number 2, remarking about our journey together as a people, coming out from Egypt and going through the Sinai desert. Number 3, that if you are in a wooden synagogue, what are you afraid of? Fire. And what can help suffocate or put out a fire but sand? And then I mentioned before that it is a tropical paradise, which means it rains all of the time. There's 2 seasons, the dry season and the wet season. In the dry season, it rains every day for about an hour. And if you want to know what the rain is like, go to your neighborhood car wash and roll down the windows, and that's the intensity of the rain. In the wet season, it's even more rain and the roads get flooded out. Now, if you're coming in with muddy shoes, what would happen on a wooden floor? You might slip and you might get it all muddy. Whereas here with the sand, it will absorb some of the water. And the 5th explanation, which I think is perhaps the most curious, relates to the converso, or what used to be called the Marranos culture of on Friday night, the hidden Jews or the secret or the crypto Jews would go down in their basement. They would cover their windows with curtains and they would light candles. And the sand in the basement would muffle the sound of the blessings and the songs that they would sing. Hence, it is the tradition of having the sand floor. And here is a picture of the synagogue when the service is happening. You'll see everyone is dressed in white for Yom Kippur. Now, Yom Kippur is an incredible day because they have a custom of getting up at 5 in the morning on the day of Kol Nidre for a sunrise service. And then they all go together to the cemetery. And then that evening is Kol Nidre. And the next day they have services all day. Now, I grew up in a more liberal tradition. I went to Reform School in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I became a Reform rabbi. And for me, services on the holidays were 3 hours, maybe 3.5. So they began services at 3. It didn't end till 2 in the afternoon. And I said, oh my gosh, this is the longest service I've ever had. And they said, oh my gosh, this is the shortest service we've ever had. Because typically it goes to 3 or 4, then they have the afternoon service, and then they have Ne'ilah. So what I did instead, I did a Torah study, and we did bibliodrama on the book of Jonah, and we did a text study. You can see the community gathers around, and it's beautiful. It used to be candlelit. Now, of course, there's the beautiful light that comes in. There's no air conditioning, but you have the breeze coming in from the ocean. And there you can see the beautiful sand on the floor. Now, what's interesting is in their liturgy, which actually comes from Shereth Israel, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue on the Upper West Side, on the west side of Manhattan. And it says, and I've highlighted it in the yellow, in Congregation Shereth Israel in New York, a blessing is added for the congregations in Amsterdam, London, Curacao, and Suriname, which aided in the establishment of its first synagogue building in 1730. So again, Suriname was the #1 Jewish destination and had the largest Jewish population in the Western Hemisphere. Here you see Sukkot. Here we are out of beautiful palm leaves and harvested. It's very hard to get a lulav and an etrog there. So you have to sort of make it for local parts. So there the etrog was a local lemon, and we made the different parts of the 4 species from the vegetation on the synagogue grounds. Here you see the unraveling of the Torah for Simchat Torah. And if you look at the people, do you note the different racial backgrounds? And again, it's a country very diverse of Blacks, whites, Hindustanis, Orientals, and everyone in between. So the synagogue president is on the left. His name is Shul. And you can see he's harvesting ginger, which is his profession. And then do you see this woman right in the middle? Her name is Flavia. In the bottom picture, you'll see she has a Hamsa sign, which is a Jewish symbol. Of course, it's also a Muslim symbol, which is interesting because her father is Muslim. Her mother is Catholic. But can anyone tell what's written on her arm? The tattoo says Alexander. She was in a relationship with a Jewish man, and their son's name is Alexander. So where else would you have a person who is half Muslim with a Hebrew tattoo? And she goes to the mosque and no one finds it offensive. They just find it wonderful that they're embracing the Jewish heritage. The country is, the community is Sephardic. For those of you who don't know the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi, Sephardic is the Jews of the Mediterranean area, from Spain and Portugal and Italy and Greece and Turkey and North Africa, as opposed to Ashkenazi, which are places from France and Germany and Poland and Russia. But the style is very different, and I had to get used to the style. So this is the comedian Modi on the ways of saying Shabbat Shalom. So let's see whether I can make it.
Yeah, give me a good Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Peaceful Shabbat Shalom. They give it to you with all they're from here. Shabbat Shalom. They almost command you to have a peaceful Sabbath. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Aleichem ve'al kol b'nechem. U'me'al kol b'nei Shabbat Shalom. They give it to you. It's passion. Ashkenazi Jews before the Sabbath. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. How are you? Okay, good.
So that's why I loved it there. I am a dog rabbi. I love hugging people and kissing people, and the Sephardic culture was very expressive that way. And let's see.
Yeah, give me.
No, okay. Previous last year, next. Okay. The older synagogue is the Tzedek V'Shalom synagogue, built in 1736. The community, since they've dwindled to just about 80 people, leased out their older synagogue to a computer store, which is kind of sad. But the interior of the synagogue, they actually loaned to the Israel Museum. And if you go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, you will see this beautiful synagogue, which they have reduced in size to about 2/3 of the actual size. And it is absolutely gorgeous. And so this is me there. I was there this past November, and just seeing it was very special. And someone asked before about, I think it was Leah, about the cemeteries. There's Ashkenazi and Sephardic ones. And if you've ever been to New Orleans, you've noticed that the cemeteries are all above ground. And that's because the water table is very low. This is at sea level. The Dutch are great for putting the beautiful canals all around, but when it rains, the water rises, and so all these beautifully maintained graves are all built above the ground. And again, as I mentioned before, how did they get the funds to build these beautiful synagogues? It was sugarcane. And if you think about Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Bahrain, these tiny little emirates and the wealth that they have, think about Dutch Guiana. In fact, the early money was the 17th century currency was sugar, tobacco, indigo, the color blue, and coffee. So a pound of sugar equaled 2 cents. And again, it's an unusual place because I'm going to hold this up. You see this? It's one of the few countries in the world which has a square coin. This is the 5-cent coin. And it's just one of the unusual idiosyncrasies of the beautiful place of Suriname. Their number one archaeological place in the country is the Joden Savan, or the Jewish Savannah. And this was called throughout the Jewish world as Jerusalem of the jungle. And it was owned, governed, and inhabited by the Jews with the highest degree of Dutch privileges. And that's what made it unique. Here's a picture of it. In 1830, you can see the boats going up and down the river, and you can see all the homes being built, all surrounding a gorgeous synagogue. And this is the remains of the original 17th century synagogue. It's been partially restored, but you can see it was large, out of bricks, and the whole community surrounded the synagogue in the same way that the ancient Mishkan, the ancient tabernacle in the desert, was surrounded by all the different tribes. And really the summary of the community is the sugar bowl, where they would boil down the sugar, and the cannon. The cannon was used for defense, because who was working on these plantations but slaves? And African slaves were brought in to places like the Barbados and to Suriname for the backbreaking labor of producing sugar. And this is the very hard, sordid, and embarrassing history of the fact that there were slaves that made the Jews rich. In fact, the #1 book, and there is even a video, a movie made, and it's called The Cost of Sugar. Highly recommended. So here you have all the slaves on the plantation, and a quarter of the plantations were indeed Jewish. So here's a question. If you're a slave, would you rather be on a Jewish plantation or on a Christian plantation? Well, think about your day off. It was mandated by the government that Sunday is the day of rest, so the slaves didn't have to work on Sunday. But if you were on a Jewish plantation, you also get off the Sabbath or Shabbat. So being on a Jewish plantation means you get off Saturday and Sunday. So some of the slaves converted to Judaism. Some of them were forcibly converted. Some of the slave owners had relations with their slaves. Today we would call that rape and non-consensual sex, and there were children that came out of that. And so the children, and some of them got Hebrew names, they grew up with observing the Jewish holidays, and a lot of customs in Suriname come from the Jewish plantations, which is the intriguing part. Now, many of the slaves would run off for freedom, and they would run off to the jungle, and they were called the Maroons. And what they wanted to do was to come and rescue other slaves. And we've seen that here in America, the whole thing of the slave revolts, and the fact that you'd have to use the military to put down the slave revolts and to protect the plantations from the slaves and the former slaves coming in to liberate their brothers. In the Judensavan, you'll see there was something known as the Fountain of Youth. The woman on the right, her name is Lily. She's the person that makes everything happen. On the left is another board member who's related to her. And in the middle was my wife. And there's a tradition, if you take water from the well there, you will live forever. Another picture of the beauty of the area, but then it started to decline when sugar beets came into the picture and sugarcane was no longer needed. And remember the story, we used to celebrate growing up Columbus Day. Here, this last year, it was called Indigenous Peoples Day. And in Suriname, it's been celebrated as Maroon Day every October 10th. And on that day, everything comes to a close and there's special celebrations. In the car that was used, that someone used to give us a ride, you'd see the slavery paper chains that school children made as an ornament, learning about the slave culture and the life of the Maroons. And here we were talking with some of descendants of the Maroons living in these indigenous villages on our left. And on the right, you'll see special Maroon dances, storytelling, and music celebrating their culture. And many of the language in Suriname has Hebrew cognates. For example, food that they don't eat, they call trefu. That is forbidden food or non-kosher. I mentioned before that the capital's name was called Torah Rica, and many of the words come from either Portuguese or Hebrew. And here is a Maroon village. You'll see they're making that interesting flatbread, which looks a little bit like our original matzah. You'll see the huts that are used, and they have some interesting traditions. For example, when women have their menstrual period, they go out to these separate huts, and then when they are finished, immerse themselves in the rivers before they can come back and rejoin their husbands. And this is part of Maroon culture coming from the Jewish family purity laws. Here is the Maroon Day festivity in the Independence Square. And then on a food court, look what they wrote, and I will translate from the Dutch, their ideals. De kracht van Samson, the strength of Samson, the wisdom of Solomon, the patience of Job, the faith of Abraham, the power of Daniel, and the might of David. So these are the ideals of the Maroons, all coming from Jewish heroes and biblical figures. I want to come to the end of this presentation and then open it up for questions by talking about palm. There's an expression, without palm, there are no birthdays. There are books on making palm, and palm is a dish originally made from potato, made by the Dutch Jews who came in. And instead, since they didn't have potatoes, they used arrowleaf elephant ear root. And it became a national dish. Here is a picture taken from the airport at the duty free. You're able to get it. And it tastes a little bit like potato kugel. It's a Passover dish that everyone loves. However, when you are making it with elephant ear root, sometimes it can be toxic and you can get an itching in your throat. And the cure from that is a rusty nail. So the Creole people put a rusty nail into the palm, and that takes away the itching, and they are able to eat it. And I submit to you that this is sort of the metaphor for Jewish life and the diversity in Suriname, whereby people take the Jewish traditions mixed with the indigenous and the Maroon culture to make a delicious recipe for tolerance, understanding, and diversity. Well, if you are interested in and you want to help Jewish Suriname, you can become a high member of the community for $18 a year, or as I did, for $180, you can become a lifetime high member. And you can find that out if you go to Suriname Jewish Community. Or you can take a picture of this or send an email to me and I'll send you the information. My email is cyberrebbe@gmail.com. And if you're interested in reading more, there are books on the Creole Jews. There's books about Jewish autonomy in a slave society. So I know we've come up to the end of the hour. We have some time for questions on anything that I've said, and I would love to hear any questions that you might have.
Well, first, Rabbi Baskin, I want to say thank you so much for bringing Suriname to life for us. Your storytelling brings it all to just being so alive, and you can just feel your enthusiasm and the richness of the culture and the history. It's a place that I knew nothing about, and so I can't thank you enough for sharing your travels and your experiences with our attendees today. So when you asked about the sand in the synagogue, was that to silence the praying? But you mentioned why one of those perhaps reasons for that. And then Pearl asked, how is this synagogue supported? And then you gave that information. And how many members does the synagogue currently have?
Yeah, so now it has about 80 individuals. It used to be a couple of thousand, and they were a very wealthy community at the time. However, after independence, so there were 150,000 people left the country. They went to, most of them went to the Netherlands. And that's why in the Netherlands, you can there's all sorts of restaurants for Surinamese food. And they have one of the largest diasporas in the world. And there was even the Suriname Diaspora Institute, and which made me think about the Jewish people here living in the diaspora. However, they do, and that's why they are a poor community, and that's why I chose to volunteer. Some of the individuals, there are some professionals, there's attorneys, there's physicians, there's people that own some of the stores, but it's an aging community, and they don't have a lot of financial resources, but they survive, and they're very frugal. They rent out, again, their old synagogue, so they have some income coming in.
There's one question. Did I miss it? Please clarify, where did the plantation slaves come from? Africa or North America, other places, countries in South America?
Oh, the slaves came from Africa. And that was the African slave trade coming from West Africa. And again, many of the slaves came first to the Caribbean, and then they went to the United States. And then, of course, slavery became illegal, thank God. But the legacy of the plantations lived on. You can still see beautiful plantations there that were built on the backs of illegally kidnapped slaves from West Africa. And that is the sad part, I think, of the Caribbean, and the sad part of the United States as we try to go forward in this area and look at reparations and what needs to be done. So, yes. And again, what the Jewish community says, well, we treated the slaves so much better than the Christians did. And that's part of the Jewish folk tradition there. The bottom line, being a slave was horrendous, and that's why people left.
Thank you.
And escaped to the jungle and became the Maroons,
Thank
which
you.
are the second largest ethnic group today. And there's even an expression, if you shake a black family tree, a Jew falls out of it.
Were you able to gather some folk tales from the Jews of Suriname?
You know, they did have interesting tales of their ancestors. So the woman that I mentioned, Lily, she can trace her heritage to Abravanel's one of the treasurers of the ancient of Isabel and Ferdinand's court. So they trace their background all the way back, and they tell their stories of how they got here and what it was like. And they take a lot of pride in their traditions, which are this amalgamation of Sephardic heritage mixed in that later with Ashkenazi and other unique things. From the cooking that they did to the games that they would play to, again, this crazy, I think, tradition, but wonderful, of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to usher in the eve of the Day of Atonement. And that's reminiscent of our custom of sometimes staying up all night on Shavuos, the festival of the receiving of the Torah. And sometimes they would say they would play games late into the night and have special treats, and then all go to synagogue at 5 in the morning. So they have some special stories. It really is an anthropological dream and a resource. And it's important to hear the stories, particularly as the older people are aging.
So I assume the original language was Ladino, since they were all Sephardic coming over.
Correct. That they would all speak Portuguese and they would speak Ladino. And so at the end of when we would have our meals together, they would always end every service with a meal. We would do Birkat Hamazon, and we would sing the Bendigamos version, which was lovely in the Ladino. By the way, you can see why I'm not a cantor, and instead I'm a rabbi.
So my question is, the few Jewish families now, what language are they speaking at home? And when did they lose the Ladino and go to the current language?
Right. So they all speak Dutch, because that is the lingua franca. Many of them, some of them know a few words of Ladino, but they don't speak it in the same way. My grandparents spoke Yiddish fluently.
Right.
Me, I know abyssal Yiddish, and my children, they know Yiddish words, but they don't speak Yiddish. So no one speaks Ladino, and no one really understands Portuguese anymore, which is sad. But they love singing the Bendigamos song.
When you were running around, you were speaking English. They spoke English well enough that you can all communicate?
Mostly, especially all the children, because the children are part of the internet and they're listening to music videos, and they are however, when we went to the National Museum, the #1 museum in Paramaribo, the exhibits were all in Dutch, and some of them were in the Srantongo, the local Creole language, but there weren't translations into English at the National Museum. And when you go, there was beautiful brochures for these beautiful jungle spots, but the brochures are all in Dutch, not in English. So that's why there's so many Dutch tourists there, but very few people from North America go. On the other hand, many, and I'm sure many of you have all been to Curacao or Aruba. But in Curacao and Aruba, while the official language may be Dutch, everyone speaks English. Here, the official language is Dutch, and many people will understand English. So I would try to speak a little bit of Dutch and would have people translate for me. And they would ask a question. I'd say, "Ja, meneer, yes, sir." And I would do my best to learn a little bit of Dutch. The prayer books are Dutch and Hebrew, but some of them were the Sephardic prayer books from the Sephardic synagogue in Shereth Israel in New York. So they were English and Hebrew. So what I would do, I brought down different readings and I translated them into Dutch so that they would understand.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you talk
I'm sorry.
about the Ashkenazi population of
Yeah.
Suriname?
Was there a refuge from World War II from Eastern Europe? Was there an Ashkenazi population at all?
Yeah. So that's the interesting thing. Again, the original community was all Sephardic, but then in the mid-19th century, German Jews started coming over, the same way that they came over to the United States and formed Jewish communities in Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Cleveland. They would go down there, they would own stores, and then some Jews fled the Holocaust and went to Suriname, but it wasn't a big haven the way that we find the Jews of Havana or the Dominican Republic, which made active efforts to bring in Jews when the borders were closed in North America to Jewish immigration from Nazi Europe.
So is there still an Ashkenazi population there?
So the Ashkenazi synagogue, again, has been leased out. The Sephardim and the Ashkenazi merged together. So
Right.
there's only one community. And so it's sort of Ashka Sephardic. The pronunciation of all the Hebrew is Sephardic. So, it's a unique amalgamation of both. But that only happened 20 years ago, because the Ashkenazi numbers had dwindled and the Sephardic had dwindled, so they came together. But there was originally an Ashkenazi rabbi, a Sephardic rabbi. It was a very well-organized community.
Did you meet any Ashkenazis? Did you meet any? Did you meet any regular Ashkenazis like us when you were down there?
Like us, everyone was sort of a combination of Ashke Sephardic, and the tunes were all different tunes. So it was challenging for me. So I let them do the nusach because I don't know, but it isn't pure Sephardic nusach. It's Surinamese Sephardic with some Ashkenazi and with some other things mixed in. So it was a very unique place. And I wanted to honor all of their different customs because I think that's the important thing.
Thank you.
Shalom, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Val. Bedankt.